The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising and have come to do him homage." When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They said to him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet, 'And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people.'" Then Herod called the Magi secretly and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word that I too may go and do him homage." After their audience with the king, they set out. And behold, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them, until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and on entering the house they saw the child with Mary his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their country by another way. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord.
Today we celebrate the feast day of the Epiphany, which is the feast day where we celebrate the Magi coming from the east to visit Jesus. Well, who exactly were these Magi, these wise men, these kings from the east? Well, basically, all that we know about them from the passage that we just heard from Matthew's Gospel is that first, they're from the east, and second, they're Magi. So they're not Jewish, and that's all that the Bible really tells us. But it doesn't really tell us why the Magi were following this star. Is it just a story in the Bible? Is it a myth? Is it just a mystery that we can't really understand? Or does the Magi traveling to see Jesus have something more to tell us? The first question immediately is, well, what is a Magi? What does that even mean? Well, Magi are not kings, as the song says, "We three kings," and they're not magicians, as it sort of sounds like Magi means. Magi were basically the scientists of the ancient world. They studied philosophy, they studied medicine, they studied the natural world, including the stars. But instead of working in universities and, technology companies like modern scientists do, they usually were hired, they were contracted by kings. A king would finance his own group of scholars, his own group of Magi, and then he would use them as consultants or translators, and he would use them as a way to sort of build reputation for his kingdom. And one group of these scholars that was revered throughout the ancient world was the Chaldean Magi. The Chaldeans were kind of the name that history has given to the people of Babylon. Babylon was an ancient city just south of what is modern-day Baghdad in Iraq. And this school of the Chaldeans was already well established centuries before Christ, 600 years before Christ. And we hear about it actually in the book of the prophet Daniel during what is called the Babylonian exile. Daniel is in the court of the king of Babylon, and he and his companions are forced into joining this school of Magi. And it's there that they study and they learn and they did amazing things, and they even kept the faith in the one true God, just as the book of Daniel describes. But the prophet Daniel, he never returned to Jerusalem. He lived his whole life as a top scholar and a royal advisor to the Babylonian king. He was a Magi of Babylon. And there he not only learned from others, but he probably, most likely, shared his faith with others and the history of his people and their prophecies and their beliefs. So given the amazing things that Daniel did and wrote in the book of the prophet Daniel in Babylon, it's not unreasonable to think that the prophecies of the Messiah were known outside of Israel, outside of Jerusalem, and that they were passed down by the generations of the Magi there. They would have wanted to learn as much as possible about the entire world, not just their own culture. And if that's the case, then it would make a lot of historical sense for St. Matthew to tell us that the wise men came from the east. They had seen the signs of the Savior's birth, and they'd come to worship the newborn King of the Jews. That's reasonable. And it's an interesting explanation of who the Magi may have been, but it doesn't explain the whole Star of Bethlehem thing. So let's take a look at that. There is modern day software that you can use. I don't know if anybody can use it. Maybe it's sort of high dollar sort of thing, but you can use software to look at what the stars would have looked like from any point on the surface of the earth from any day in history. And if you look at what the stars would have looked like from Babylon in the Chaldeans in the year surrounding the birth of Jesus, it gets very interesting. The Star of Bethlehem, if we're going by what St. Matthew tells us, it couldn't have been anything really that obvious, because when the wise men show up to Herod and they said, well, we see this star of the new king, and he's very perplexed by this. So it wouldn't have been anything obvious to the normal layperson or to somebody who wasn't educated in astronomy. And so that would rule out like a shooting star or a comet or anything like that. So what do we see in the sky around the year that Jesus was born? Well, you're going to have to try to picture this in your head because it's not easy. It's kind of nerdy. But when you look at the planets in the sky, sort of because of the way that the Earth tilts and wobbles as it spins, the tracks that the planets make are sort of circular. And they go and they tilt and wobble with the spin of the Earth. And the planet Jupiter, being the biggest of the planets, is the brightest planet in the sky. It's brighter than most stars. And if you follow the motion of Jupiter back and forth, at this point in history, instead of just making a circular motion, it would have created sort of an elliptical motion, or like a crown, an oval. And this pattern of Jupiter would have appeared above the star known as Regulus. Jupiter is sort of known as the king of the planets, named after the king of the Roman gods. And the brightest of the planets. And then Regulus also means king. So we're kind of have this idea of king in mind, just looking at the very basics. Also, at that time and place, this occurred inside the constellation Leo, which is the lion. And so the Magi would have recognized, based off of their knowledge of the surrounding cultures and what had been handed on by Daniel, the Magi would have recognized that the lion is the biblical symbol for the Israelite tribe of Judah, which the Old Testament prophecies predicted that the Messiah would come from the tribe of Judah. So that's sort of a second coincidence. You have this theme of a king within the tribe of Judah. Also, at that time, the constellation that rose in the east after Leo is Virgo, the Virgin. And so you have Judah, which is associated with this tribe of the Messiah. You have a king as a theme, and now you have a virgin. And right at you could say, the feet of the constellation, at that particular moment in history was the new crescent moon. A virgin standing on a moon is a very familiar image to any Catholic. She's usually depicted in many cases standing on the moon. And so this is another Old Testament prophecy that the Messiah would be born of a virgin from the tribe of Judah, the tribe of the lion. So you have all these things lining up. It's a king of the Jewish tribe of Judah, and it would be born of a virgin. And then, if you fast forward 9 months later, interestingly enough, the planet Jupiter was no longer over the planet Regulus, the king star and the king planet. They weren't lined up anymore. Instead, Jupiter came so close to the planet Venus that their light merged, and it would have been at the time the brightest thing in the sky. And so you have the mother planet, Venus is known as the mother planet, lining up with the king planet. Sort of makes icing on the cake if you put it all together theologically in your head. If at that point the Magi had then begun their journey, the time they would have reached Jerusalem, the orientation of Jupiter and Venus would have been different. Babylon is 1,000 miles away from Jerusalem. And so looking up from Jerusalem, they would have seen that the star, or Jupiter, would have actually appeared in the south instead of the east, or the west from Babylon, which means that south of Jerusalem is Bethlehem. So they would have traced it to Bethlehem. And also at that time, strangely enough, Jupiter's motion would have made it in such a way that it would have appeared to have stopped in its tracks. It wouldn't have moved at all. And that's exactly what Matthew's gospel tells us, that the star rested over Bethlehem. So here we have historical and scientific hypotheses that it doesn't just not contradict the Bible, it actually might shed new light on it. The theory means that unbelievers can't just dismiss this as, a tall tale or some sort of fantasy. It's not just a Christian myth, because something sort of unusual did happen in the sky during this time in human history. But it also means for us as believers that we shouldn't just dismiss things that we read about in the Bible as a mystery that we can't, well, it's a mystery, God's not going to tell us any more about that, we might as well move on. We can look into things deeper and gain a deeper understanding and an appreciation for God. The events that were witnessed by the Magi, they weren't miracles. They were all natural events. They didn't suspend the normal laws of nature. In fact, and what I think is even more amazing, is that the stars and the planets, if you take them to mean what I just explained to you, the stars and the planets were working like clockwork, and they only could have worked in that way. So exact that we can even go back in history and create a computer program that can replay it for us. That's how exact in their movements they are. Which means, and this is the most amazing thing to me of all, that from the beginning of time, when God set the clock of the universe in motion, he already foresaw Christmas Day. He already foresaw the journey of the wise men. He already foresaw all the prophecies leading up to that. And it shows us that the universe around us is all designed for God, but for our salvation. The universe itself is centered on Jesus Christ, our Savior and our Redeemer. And the God who guides the entire universe, who guided the Magi to Bethlehem, also wants to guide us in our lives in the littlest details, simply because he loves us and he knows that he needs our help. So as we celebrate the feast day of the Epiphany, we have to come before God and once again promise to him that we, like the Magi, will gladly follow wherever he leads us.